All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at this Ladies at UX Boston event. My name is Lara Caveza and I'm a design manager at Notarize.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie Langerman and I'm a senior UI UX engineer at CarGurus.
Hi everyone, I am Olga Perfilieva and I'm a senior product designer at BotKeeper.
Cool. And so the three of us co-organized the Boston Ladies at UX chapter. Ladies at UX is a meetup group for people in the field of user experience design and product design. Our mission is to celebrate and empower the women in our field. And while our events are open to everyone to attend, all of our speakers are amazing women in the field of UX and design and product. And you're going to hear from several of them tonight. So we're really excited about that. Cool. Next slide, Katie. Our community is dedicated to providing a safe environment for all of our attendees, and we don't tolerate harassment of any form here at our events. So please take a look at our code of conduct if you haven't yet, and let us know if you have any questions about our policy. All right, so when we hold in-person events, we spent a bit of time at the beginning giving you the floor. So during this time, you could share any job openings, any upcoming events, anyone looking for a job. And so in this new remote format, we'd still love to hear from you. So now instead of the floor being yours, the chat is yours. So please post in the chat, let folks know if you're hiring, if you're looking for a job, or any other interesting announcements that you might have. Thank you. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Katie now.
Thanks, Lara. All right, so our next event is currently in the works in collaboration with Ladies at UX Seattle. We're really excited to bring our two groups together to network and dive into a topic around authentic leadership. So stay tuned for more details around our November event. We always like to remind you about our monthly newsletter where we share event updates and more. Make sure you join to stay up to date on events and to hear more details about our upcoming leadership series with Ladies at UX Seattle. Lastly, we just want to go over a few Zoom things before we get started. So feel free to use the chat throughout the event, as Lara said. And if you have questions for the panelists, try to keep them for the end when we do a little bit of Q&A after we go through the questions. We will also be recording this event and posting online at some point, and we'll make sure to share that with all of you. And you should be able to see a poll surveying everybody's backgrounds. Hopefully that's live now. And make sure that you take a moment to vote in that so we can get a sense of who's here tonight. All right, now I'm gonna hand this off to Olga to kick off the event.
Thank you, Katie. So tonight's event is sponsored by BotKeeper. BotKeeper provides human-assisted automated accounting solutions, which combine artificial intelligence and machine learning technology with high-quality skilled accountants to deliver a full suite bookkeeping and pre-accounting solutions to accounting firms and their clients. Thank you, BotKeeper, for being our sponsor. Also, I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that BotKeeper is looking for a mid to senior level product designer, and I posted a link in the chat with that job description. And now, while we still have a poll going, I am gonna go into introducing our panelists. Our first panelist is Maya Rhinehart. Maya is a self-taught product designer, artist, ex-civil engineer, mental health advocate, Spanish language learner, and aspiring writer. She currently works as a lead UX designer at Athena Health. Over the past few years, she has embarked on a self-compassion and acceptance journey that she has led her across the globe. In her spare time, Maya enjoys reading, doodling, designing and building websites for nonprofits, mentoring junior designers, and perfecting her chocolate chip cookie recipe. Maya's design superpowers are system logic and thinking, and data doodles.
Hey, everybody. Nice to virtually meet you all. Thanks for the intro, Olga.
Thank you, Maya. Our next panelist is Cara McGrath. Cara is a designer based in Boston who grew up with a strong desire to express herself creatively. She first explored her passion digitally in the early 2000s with meticulous late-night portraiture of musicians and cartoon characters in Microsoft Paint. She earned her degree in graphic design at Northeastern University, started her professional career in visual design, and made her way to digital product world. Today, Cara works as a senior product designer at ezCater and brings a passion for streamlined user experiences and meaningful business outcomes to her work. Cara's superpowers are asking as many questions as she possibly can so she can get to the bottom of things quickly.
Thank you, Olga. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here tonight. Thanks, Olga.
Hi, Cara. Next, I'd like to introduce Tyler Pietri. Tyler is a product manager at Klaviyo. She's passionate about setting up products and people with strong foundations for growth. At Klaviyo, Tyler spends her time unweaving complex products to provide delightful experiences at scale. In her personal time, she's a co-founder of Paid Forward, soon to be Network to Equity, a tool that connects Black people with a network of professionals excited to give them a seat at the table. Tyler's superpowers are going deep. If there is a nutty, poorly understood functionality, she is going to untangle it.
Thanks so much, Olga. Thanks everyone for having me. Super excited.
And lastly, I would like to introduce you to Hilary Walker. Hilary is a senior product manager at Notarize, specifically focused at their real estate vertical. She started out her professional life as a nonprofit fundraiser before discovering UX design and making the switch a little over 5 years ago. While she really enjoyed being a designer, she had the opportunity to take on a product manager role and has loved getting to blend her passion for design and the user with understanding and helping to manage the organization's long-term strategic product goals. Hilary's superpowers are that she's not afraid to ask a lot of questions, even the seemingly obvious ones, to dig below the surface with the user or organization. She once had a customer offer her to make her new business cards with the job title Software Therapist.
Oops, muted. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Olga.
Hi, Tyler. And now I'm gonna just announce the goal of today's panel. So our goal for today's event is to explore what great product thinking means. Product design and product management roles each encompass specialized responsibilities. As designers, we might think of the product from the perspective of our users and how to best solve their problems. As PMs, we might approach it more from a business side to meet the business goals and objectives. But overall, designers and PMs have a common goal to build stellar products that our users will find desirable, those that are ethical, accessible, impactful, and profitable for our business. In this panel discussion, we'll hear from these 4 amazing women about how they navigate their everyday work while incorporating this product thinking philosophy. Everybody still with me? Excellent. All right, and now, so what do we have with the poll? It looks like majority of our attendees today are designers. We have some good attendance from product managers, a few engineers, good amount of students, and other. Excellent. All right. Are we ready to go into the questions now? Cool, let's do this. All right, so my first question, let me just scroll to the right page. All right, let's begin this panel discussion by defining what product thinking is. Hilary, what does being a great product thinker mean to you?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that really come to mind. The first one is just the ability to really listen and observe. And I think that's something that applies, you know, both externally as you're thinking about the users that you're working with and that you're building the product for. But also, especially, you know, I think something that I think a lot about from the product management side is how it applies internally. So, you know, day one, when you join a company or a new team, really trying to understand the dynamic and where everyone adds unique value and what the strengths of the individual team members are, so that you can really work together to deliver that amazing product experience together. You're never on your own. You're sort of adapting and working with your teammates. And I think in that same sort of vein, you know, being really flexible and keeping an open mind, not coming with a prescribed solution, but really being open to everyone's ideas and being flexible and secure enough to change your mind if you've started going down the wrong path or you get newer and better information, and not just holding on to that original vision that you had. And I think maybe lastly, one of the most important ones is balance. And I think, you know, again, coming from the PM perspective, really being able to balance the key business results that, you know, you're hearing from stakeholders and across the company against the sort of immediate user experience needs and possibility for improvement that you have. I think that's often one of the most difficult parts of my job, thinking about, you know, everything that we want to do, but then how do we kind of scope that back, and how do you know when you need to move really quickly and scrappily versus how do you know when you need to, you know, take the time and do a lot of research in order to get it right that first time. And so sort of, you know, being able to understand the 10,000 foot view strategic vision and balancing that against sort of the actionable steps you can take to move forward.
Thank you, Hilary. And Maya, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So wholeheartedly agree with everything Hilary just said. All of that is incredibly important. And to pull off that kind of balanced idea and looking at everything from 10,000 feet, it's definitely important to consider systems thinking. So in that, I mean, not just the product or the final user, but the entire ecosystem of that product and everything that's intertwined within it. So it can seem really daunting and overwhelming, but in looking at everything wholeheartedly or holistically can help you be a better product thinker, as well as how best to enable that ecosystem. So what bits and pieces make that thing move and are needed to continue it moving forward, and that everything you change, of course, within the product will cause some sort of reaction that you may or may not anticipate. So tying into Hilary said, being flexible to be able to move and adjust to those changes. And then I'd say, of course, within that, from the design perspective, you've always got to advocate for your users. It's a core function of our job. So in doing that in the short term and the long term, as well as communicating well and driving that strategic vision forward in a collaborative way across teams, which I made sound really easy in one sentence, but can be incredibly difficult and daunting. So just kind of not only just planning that systems thinking or the product that I mentioned, but all the other little interactions, communication bits, documents you need to produce, what have you, to move things forward is actually a little bit of it too. And then the last part I'd say is continuing to learn. So I feel like I learn a lot about strategy and product thinking and all of these things from other folks on my team, and then some who aren't even on my team, whether that be your product owner, product manager, or honestly anybody making any strategic decisions. I try to also, you know, listen and see where they're moving, because of course other folks might have better ideas than you, but you know, timing is so important and things like that as well. It's also important to be humble and learn yourself from the entire experience.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Maya. Some of the topics that you touched on, users and strategic thinking, we're definitely gonna cover in the upcoming questions. But yeah, those were excellent answers. I would like to move on to the next question, and this is where we're going to be talking about strategy. Tyler, could you talk about the time when it was helpful to have a designer in a room in one of your strategic meetings with business leadership?
Yeah, I think having designers sit in and be a part of those meetings is important for getting leadership to have a whole product mindset, because product is really the sum of all of its parts. It's everything that your user interacts with, from support to help docs to the literal, like how they click buttons on the screen. And I think having them involved is integral to elevating design from an afterthought to like a core part of the product that you're producing, and something that has just as much impact on your acquisition and your retention and your monetization as literally any other part of the product that you're developing. One specific use case I can think of, you know, my team and I just released a major reporting feature, and the designers I was working with was so integral to how we did user research on the product, to how we qualified the design for the product, and just having her sit there and be able to talk about the criticality of those things and why we're taking that approach was really helpful. Because I think a designer is really the person that's best suited to speak to the criticality and importance of design, its business impact and its repercussions to leadership. So I think it's great to have them involved in those meetings.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. I definitely, well, as one of the designers, as a designer myself, I definitely feel like we need definitely more involvement in these strategic meetings, and I full-heartedly agree with everything that you just said. So from the designer perspective, Cara, would you mind sharing is there a benefit of being part of strategic leadership conversation, and do you have any examples that you could share with us?
Sure. Thank you, Olga. Well, yeah, I could say I could take this from both sides. I would say there's benefits for myself as the designer for doing my work more effectively, as well as helping the group out. So I would say, as Tyler mentioned, you know, like each discipline brings something different to the table. Obviously, design is, you know, not exempt from that. For myself, I find it's important when attending these conversations to get a better understanding of the business goals and the goals of the stakeholders involved in the project. I think getting that firsthand rather than through, you know, emails, Slacks, or a chain of people can really help get to the heart of the problem. Similarly to how we get to users' problems, it's helpful to kind of get straight to the stakeholders. I think also building that trust with stakeholders and strong partnerships with other folks around the company, engineers, et cetera, can really help bringing the strategy forward as well. And then on the other hand, what design can bring to the table, I would say is a few things. Definitely championing the voice of the user. I think that's kind of our #1 job, speaking about the user, when many other folks in the room might be thinking about, you know, technical difficulties or business problems a bit more. I think also kind of being that person who really genuinely knows the intricacies of the product and the workflows really well can help bring up examples of, you know, this might not work because of X, Y, and Z. And then finally, I would say we are very much in the position to successfully facilitate good conversations. I think that designers are well suited to take in the needs of many people in a room and be able to facilitate successful ideation and workshops. I can think of just one quick example that happened recently. I was speaking with a PM and an engineering manager about how we were going to execute on a new feature. And the engineering manager said, I think it would be best if we did it this way. And I said, I kind of just asked why. I said, are you speaking to, a user's perspective that you heard? And he said, no, actually, I wasn't thinking about that at all. I was just thinking about how I would do it technically. And then we were really able to have that conversation, kind of both laying out our priorities on the line.
That's an excellent example. Thank you so much for sharing, Cara.
I think if I can jump in too, I just want to kind of echo Cara there a little bit. I think even from a, as a product manager coming from a design background, it's so important to, like, even if you think you have the sort of user in mind, I think having that person whose job there really is to, really advocate for them is so important, because, you do have other things floating around in your mind, and you may not have that perspective always. Sorry, you probably are also hearing a toddler in the background right now.
Totally fine. Yeah, Hilary, I definitely agree with you. Thank you so much for jumping in. Maya, my next question is to you, and we're going to continue talking about strategy. What does being strategic mean to you with what you do as a designer?
Yeah, this is a great question, as well as when I was approaching, this talk as well as these questions, it was interesting. Most of my background is working in small consulting firms on a design team of like 1 or 2 of us designers. If we were lucky, there were 2 of us. And now that I'm at Athena, it's very different at a company of like 8,000 with 80 plus designers, and just even like in my general area alone, we're at over 10. So it's very different in thinking about strategy from one perspective on a design team of 1 or 2 to the opposite, as well as it's different to think about strategy throughout your career as a designer. So I think I'm going to try to hit a little bit of all of that in this answer. And so of course, ideally, strategy is thinking beyond where your scope of work ends to consider future possibilities beyond the immediate roadmap and current market trends that might, as well as current market trends that might influence that strategic direction. And this includes between teams to ensure that there's a cohesive structure that makes sense, as well as your company's more blue sky, larger strategic roadmap. And this is definitely true more for, say, at Athena, where I'm working in-house on a product. In consulting, this might look like one gig or one project that you're working on. And so learning to be strategic, I'd say, is, at least in my how I've learned, is predominantly done by observing what like others more senior than yourself do, and also just what happens over time. And so as a newer designer, of course, you start small, like what does the next release look like for you and your team? The one after, if you're in consulting, that might just look like what even is like halfway through this project look like. And then of course, begin to notice and understand the importance of timing and priority within the larger roadmap and who your key communication partners are. And so something that I definitely learned to do within consulting, where I was working in such a fast-paced environment, is to look beyond not only my strategic design decisions, like I mentioned, in terms of trends and things like that and the technology you're using, but also the relationships I've built within the organization and key stakeholders. And so I didn't mean it I don't mean it in like a diabolical or like evil way, just that there's more to being strategic than just like the designs themselves and making sure that they adhere to your constraints. It's also, like I mentioned, like timing when you introduce your new ideas, as well as, getting on good terms with certain folks to make sure that you do have a seat at the table and are prepared for those conversations. And so being strategic within Athena now is different just because I'm still learning who are those stakeholders, you know, what are the processes here, and how can I make these decisions for our roadmap and our release this upcoming July while I'm still trying to figure out what is going on in the system itself. And so it's a bit of give and take, where I'll like throw an idea out there, see how it goes, and then you know, find a compromise in the middle, as well as looking at artifacts from other folks and seeing where that lands me. So it's just a lot of targeted guesses, for lack of a better term, but over time you get better and better at said guesses. And so I guess my overall message is don't be afraid to like start thinking strategically, even if you are a new designer, because those skills just get easier and better over time. Your strategy might just look a little bit different than the larger roadmap, but it's interesting to see, like, if you know, suggest an idea or just wrote something down, and then if you stay at the company for a certain amount of time and you see, okay, this is where we landed, how did we get there, right? Like, what brought us here? So that backwards process can help you build some strategic skills. So that was a very long-winded answer with a few parts within it, but hopefully that made some sense. And that is essentially what strategy means to me and what I do as a designer.
I can. Something that Maya mentioned is so important. Like, visibility is key to strategy. No one's going to think you're strategic if they don't know who you are. So you need to put yourself out there, talk about the value that you're providing, you know, give them sort of an insight into how the sausage is made and how you're coming at certain decisions. It's going to feel really uncomfortable at first, but that visibility element is so huge in getting people to recognize your strategic capacity and ability to just contribute to these conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point. Making things visible is one of the key ingredients to success, for sure, for designers. So I wanted to just follow up with Cara. Cara, do you have anything to add to this as a designer, and any secret recipes you would like to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think designers are strategic in a lot of ways. Maya and Tyler, you both brought up some points that made me, I was thinking during your answer, about how important it is to be strategic in what you show at what time. A former manager of mine told me this, you know, when you're bringing ideas to stakeholders, even if you think you've maybe figured it out and you're already kind of at more final designs, sometimes it's not great to show folks final designs if they haven't seen anything yet. You know, you really want to make sure that you're communicating to them that things can still be changed and that you're flexible, and just bringing folks in at the right time in the right process is important. I would say, aside from that, I could just talk a little bit about like kind of releasing product too. So we've talked a lot about like strategy, you know, during the process, but I think, you know, having experience releasing larger features over the past couple of years, we've had to make a lot of trade-offs around, you know, how we could strategically release things in pieces. So oftentimes features are really just like the sum of many bits and pieces of different functionality. So I think it's really important for the designer during this process to make it really clear to the team when we're talking about scope, you know, like, what are we going to be missing if we don't launch everything? Or how can we release this in a way that we can still get the benefits, you know, right away and then follow up with more. So the way I kind of think about that is like, you know, can we build a simple version first, or can we build part of this feature and launch it and then follow up with the other part? And just kind of asking ourselves if we're accomplishing our goals and if we're staying in scope.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Cara. And this brings us to the next question. When we define the scope for a product, Hilary, what process do you follow and who do you get involved in that?
Yeah, I think this is one where I think the process sometimes changes. I think defining the scope is iterative. And And depending on the size of the project, maybe how much you know about it to begin with, I think that that process can really change. So I think, initially I will tend to work with whatever stakeholders I have, whether they're customers or internal stakeholders, to really kind of understand the problem that we're trying to solve, define the problem. I feel like at that point, sometimes the scope, you let your imagination run wild and the scope is really big and you're excited about every single possibility that you can explore. And so starting to really understand, like pare it back down, like what are the basic requirements? I think going back to strategy, like looking at the roadmap, what do you have capacity to do from a design standpoint, from an engineering standpoint, from a time standpoint? Where does this project fall in comparison to all of the other priorities that you have? How does that help define how much time and energy you can spend on it? So at that point, you'll start to, like, I think, really have a better understanding of, what the scope is going to be. So yeah, basic requirements, who your primary users are. I think depending on where the project is coming from, you as a product manager or designer might already have a lot of those. You might have to go out and do a lot more discovery. And then, at Notarize, one of the things that I really enjoy is that the product manager, the designer, and the tech lead are all working really closely together throughout that whole process, and continuing to sort of refine and evaluate the project as we go. Whether that's through, initial brainstorms, design reviews, any, amount of user testing that we get to do. And I think it's a good opportunity to sort of reevaluate and negotiate and have those sometimes hard conversations between PM, designer, and engineer about, what makes the most sense. We can't refactor the whole back end, or, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I guess just iterative over time, focus on the basic requirements and make sure that we're delivering the value to the customer.
Thanks so much. Sorry, go ahead.
Mind if I just kind of hop in and add on to that? That completely resonates with me and really kind of brings me back to, like, I don't know, there's that point when you're trying to release something and it's like, you're just having a conversation of like, can we ship it without this? Like, no, we really need this part. That's like the constant fun. I think it's fun. It's sort of like a puzzle of like, what pieces do we really need to make this work? And like the way that I always think about that is, like when you're thinking of a trade-off on a certain, feature or a little subset of the feature, just kind of like discussing, are we going to get the data we need if we don't release this? Are we going to see any business gains if we don't release it? Is the user going to understand what to do if we don't release this part? Like, are they going to get stuck? Is it going to be unusable? And I guess, like, does it fit in with their mental model, or are we just stripping too much away? So that's kind of how I like to think about it when I'm having to make a case for releasing more or having to release a little less.
Yeah, I think to that point, like, it just is continuously, I think it's continuously changing. Like, something might take a lot longer on the front end of the project, and then you thought you were going to be able to release it much sooner, and you're starting to make some of those hard decisions about like, well, we do need to get this out the door. Can we, maybe cut back on this element of it, and what effect does that have? So.
Those are great answers. Thank you both for answering that question. And it brings us to the next question, which is also related to scope. And so we have all been there. We have a roadmap and the features have been defined and prioritized, but ideas and distractions keep flying from all different directions. I've personally been there myself. And sometimes it happens every day in meetings, through emails, client feedback, customer support feedback. I have a question for Tyler. How do you know when to dodge those and keep the team focused, or to change the scope and incorporate these ideas into your roadmap?
Yeah, oh boy, that's my everyday. So one of the things that I really try to be aware of are thinking traps, particularly one called recency bias. So I think that, you know, as people that work in tech, the time that we're most likely to overestimate the value and impact of something is like when we're actively discussing it, we're actively hearing about it. So I think being aware of that is really important, because if you don't realize it, that can lead to poor road mapping decisions where you're basically prioritizing an issue whose perceived impact doesn't actually align with its literal strategic impact on the company. So I think being really aware of those biases and just training yourself to point them out and ask people those questions, like, is this really that important, or has it just come up 2 times this week and now you think it's important? And having a stance on that has been really helpful for me. Something else that I also try to do, and this is going to sound super cheesy, but prevention is better than a cure in a lot of ways. And I think that comes back to being strategic and really defining and aligning on what the end state for your product or your feature set needs to be. You know, so having kind of a larger enduring vision of what your end state is and how you want to get there, I think can stave off some of those road mapping issues, just because it accelerates decision making. People understand what the phases are to get there. And when they ask you about, you know, what about this project? What about that project? Actually, what they're doing is they're taking a step back and thinking about the overall vision and wondering, okay, what does it fit into this? So that's been a really pleasant approach for me, because ultimately you can use that end state and that vision, you know, as a forcing function, because it defines the boundaries that you want to work within. And then it also kind of forces you and the people who are asking you to make a determination around and a use case around, you know, does this project get me closer to that end state? Does it get closer to realizing that vision in a sustainable, scalable way, in a way that sequentially makes sense? And if not, because you have that defining vision, it's really easy to say, yes, this does make sense, or no, it doesn't, and go from there.
Excellent. Does anybody have anything to add to it? Great. It brings me to the next topic of this discussion. Let's talk about users. We all know that speaking to users on a regular basis is essential to product success. And this question again, I'd like to ask Tyler, how do you incorporate the feedback that you gather from speaking to the users into prioritization decisions?
Yeah, so I actually like to have a little bit of a process, which is gather the feedback, synthesize it, formulate some kind of opinion or stance on it, and then continuously revalidate that opinion, and it forms a nice virtuous loop that can help you with your prioritization decisions. For the first step of that, gathering feedback, what I really try to focus on is getting sort of a richness there. So I like to do what I call diversity of extremes. So talking to users who are just on complete opposite ends of my user base, my power users, my users that churned out from features, my users that only log in once a month or what have you, because I think that really helps you understand how different people are thinking about things and what's important to them as different audiences. And then I also think about, you know, how can I extend my range, you know, as a product manager? I have tens of thousands of customers. I can't possibly talk to all of them. So I try to find ways to get feedback from as many of them as I can. And oftentimes that's by leveraging kind of the customer facing teams around me, you know, your support staff, your sales staff, your success teams, really having them communicate what some of the things that they're seeing. That just gives you more richness around the feedback that you can use for prioritization decisions. From there, you know, the next thing I really think about is synthesis. Just what are the common themes? What are the common opportunities? Just finding a way to lump those into categories and find what the common threads are can really help you think about like what truly are your priorities and what is the right way to organize those sequentially. And then from that, you know, you've basically formed your opinion, and you can revalidate that by talking to customers and making sure, you know, the opportunities that I originally sequenced in this order, does they still make sense? Have market forces sort of changed how customers are thinking about it? Ultimately, I find that, you know, your users will tell you what's important to them if you just give them time to speak without interruption. They will naturally bring up the things that they care about the most. So trusting them to tell you that, and not trying to like suggest features to them, which is it's a really hard skill to build off of. But just trusting them to tell you what's important are all the ways that I've sort of worked on incorporating that feedback into my road mapping decisions.
Thank you, Tyler. Maya, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Sure. Well, first I'd like to say that Tyler, can I work with you forever? Because that sounds like a great plan. That is definitely the ideal that I want to work under. So that was a fantastic answer. So I would say what Tyler said, that loop sounds great. And of course, once you've gathered that necessary information via the arsenal of tools as a designer, usability tests, interviews, surveys, to create an informed decision that you then, of course, go through the process that Tyler described. The one thing I'd add is just like, how do you become that squeaky wheel and continue to bring up users' needs at optimal times? And of course, it helps to bring your stakeholders and the greater team in at the beginning. And you don't have to let them in on everything, but it's just the simple, like, have them partake in the interviews or what have you, so that they can see the user's pain points firsthand. And, you know, graphs are great, but it's hard to disprove what folks have seen with their own eyes. And so that can help bolster prioritization, and of course, make advocating easier down the road. And then of course, just partnering with your product manager and dev team to prioritize what should be built when, based off of some of that prioritization, as well as, of course, there are other constraints at play. And then just figuring out that logical release cycle. But yeah, that's the only thing I would really add.
Thank you so much, Maya. You and I both, I would like to work with Tyler too.
Olga, do you mind if I just add something quickly too?
Absolutely.
I think you both hit the nail on the head, and one kind of trick I like to use is just like, you know, if you have an improvement that you know needs to be made and maybe it's hard to get it prioritized, if it's small enough that you've already done the design or it's really just a JIRA ticket, make a JIRA ticket, put it in the backlog, because then when prioritization comes, if your team's looking for like an extra 1 or 2 to pull in, it's ready to go. There's nothing easier than already having work ready to go. So that's kind of my sneaky way of helping get little user fixes in.
I love that and totally agree, because I will say there have definitely been moments in my PM career where we're looking at the plan for the week and I'm like, we don't have shovel ready work for this engineer. Like, we need something for them to do. And you're looking at the list going like, man, I wish we had a design for this or this. And if they're in there, we'll pull them.
Yeah, also building off of that, that is like, those smaller projects are such amazing work for onboarding new devs, like as you build out your teams, just giving them a small, like couple of immediate wins so you can build their confidence and get them wrapped into what you're doing. Like, love everything about that.
That's awesome. All right. My next question is about metrics. Tyler, what's your process of choosing UX metrics for your product?
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit that picking metrics is not easy. There's like 1,000 options that you can go with. What I try to do is to start off with being, you know, outcome focused and answer the question, what is the actual outcome I'm trying to drive? And if I took that to the most extreme possible, you know, what would the implications be? So, you know, for example, at Klaviyo, I own our audiences. So lists, clusters of profiles, all of that stuff. And, an easy metric for me to pick is just, customers creating as many audiences as possible. But when I think about that and take it to its extreme, it's, what does that mean? Does that mean that someone has 1,000 audiences and they no longer know what they're for or how to use them or how to manage them? So really what I care about isn't customers making a lot of audiences, it's customers making useful audiences that they then actually incorporate into other features across our platform. So really being outcome focused and thinking about the exact behavior you're trying to drive your customer to is sort of where I start when I'm thinking about UX metrics. And then I think the next phase is just, differentiate between the stages of your product. The metrics that you pick for your launch are not going to be the same metrics that you pick when you think about long-term future success, because one focuses a lot on acquisition, one's going to focus a lot on retention and satisfaction. So being really clear about what phase your product is in and having metrics that align with those phases and covering those bases is really helpful.
Great, thank you so much for the answer. Whose responsibility is it to define the UX metrics for your product? Do you get anybody involved in that?
I think it depends. I think my gut instinct is I think everyone can be an amazing leader and everyone has something to add. I am not the font of all wisdom for product stuff. So I don't think, it's one particular person that owns coming up with all the metrics. I do think you need to have one owner whose responsibility it is to ensure that it gets done and who's sort of responsible for gathering the feedback from all the right stakeholders and synthesizing that. But UX can contribute really amazing ideas to metrics that they're concerned about. I actually recently had a customer-facing person, they manage our agency partners, and she talked to me about metrics that she was concerned about for retention, and I didn't even think of that. So really leveraging the people around you, but just making sure that you have one person to drive that is kind of my convoluted answer to that question.
Yeah, I think this is one of those where, the roles of product design and research kind of get into a gray area in some categories. And I feel like metrics is one of those in my experience.
Yeah, I would agree. The interesting that's happening. So in my past roles, I feel like within consulting, metrics are just all over the place depending on what you're trying to even produce. But at Athena, I'm feeling pretty spoiled. We've got like an entire design ops team to help you as a designer, like figure out which research methods to use, as well as what you're going to measure there, as well as in terms of metrics. Like Cara just mentioned, it is, and Tyler just mentioned, it's a balance. I believe like we are actually defining, there's this whole new initiative that's coming out documenting sort of between PM or PO design and engineering, like who leads, who owns, and all that stuff. So for metrics specifically, I'd say like success metrics are kind of owned by the PM or PO, at least that we're now at Athena. But then like I own the UX metrics, like I'm owning like all the backup data to like make sure we're headed in the right direction. And so this is definitely like a new space for me right now that's been very interesting to like ramp up on. But yeah, it's a big mush.
Thanks everybody for jumping in. Metrics are hard for sure. And now we are going to talk about the next question, and that is about the health of your product team. Maya, I'm going to ask you this question first. What is the secret sauce in keeping your product team engaged and motivated? And by that, I mean, so when I say product team, I mean product manager, designer, and engineering.
Sure, yeah. So for this question, I kind of want to focus on one specific area, I'd feel like, I mean, I'm fairly new at Athena, but it feels like the product team being engaged and motivated is pretty good. But in my past role, there was just a bit of a shift, and I always believe it's always good, right? Everybody should have some sort of seat at the table, as well as a like a stake in the ground, or like a feeling that they, you know, contributed to a project and can own their portion and like really feel like they had an impact. And so I'd say in my past job at the consulting firm I worked for, it was a design build, and all of our developers were located in Costa Rica, which kind of just naturally creates a divide, not just because of the distance. I'm sure a lot of us are experiencing this by working remotely, but also a little bit of a cultural, and then also all of them, English was their second language, which I'm sure some of us can, you know, we're dealing with that with developers and other folks, you know, worldwide. And so one of the big things for me, and I noticed over time, was the engineering team just got brought in like later and later and later. And instead, like one tech lead or something would speak for them. And it of course leads to problems down the road, right? Like, I feel like very selfishly, for my work to look good, like I gotta have the engineering team like on my side, right? Like they need to understand and like trust my decisions, as well as be able to feed some of those decisions that I was making. And so one of the things I worked really, really hard to do was a few fold. Like I just really tried to simply build that relationship. And I'm not saying like become best friends with everybody, but it was simply just a hey, like I will prioritize you and your needs. Like I will make time for you because I know that it's important down the road when I hand this design off to you, like it's on you to make this work. So I did a lot of preemptive work, like asking questions, sending not ready designs. And again, it was a small team. It was like myself and one other designer and like 30 developers. And so you might have other channels to do this in a less like random way within your organization. But for me, it was very like ad hoc, just to try to build up that like impact, like understanding that, hey, like you are influencing this decision. I'm just not making it out of nowhere, as well as I'm staying, of course, within the technical limitations. I'm trying to make both of our jobs easier, right? And so it's not much of a secret sauce, but it's just simply being a bit more human and trying to bridge a bit of that cultural divide, as well as distance divide, and just making sure that there was always time and always like I didn't mind explaining things a few times. I wanted them to understand the reasons behind the decisions I'd made, because a lot of them seemed really random without that context. And so, yeah, for me, it's essentially building that sense of trust, understanding that you're using a communication style that works for everyone, and if not, figuring out what that is, as well as just building that cohesive relationship of communication. So it's not anything too groundbreaking, but that is what I experienced mostly and what has worked for me.
Thank you, Maya. Hilary, is there anything you'd like to add to it from the perspective of a PM? How do you keep your team feel empowered and maintain a sense of ownership?
Yeah, I mean, I think Maya really nailed it with sort of the relationship building. And I think, you know, tying that back to, you know, one of the initial points that I brought up related to sort of like what makes a great product thinker, but like listening and observing and building up those, I don't know, building those relationships with your team members and listening to what they have to say and making them feel included in all of the decisions that you're making. I think everyone has a ton to offer. And I really feel like, you know, as a PM, you're doing a lot of coordination, and you may be the one, you know, talking to customers initially and everything like that, but it's really like, it's a team sport. You're kind of bringing together all of these elements and helping sort of convene everyone around a common goal. And I think to that end, there's sort of this element of sales in the PM and design role that you don't hear a lot about. You're, you know, you have to get everyone on your team excited about what you're doing. You have to talk about the future vision of this feature or product. You have to sort of help them feel the customer's pain, and that can be really hard. And I think everyone's brought up really good points throughout this about how you keep people empowered and engaged. It's, you know, bringing in engineers on customer calls. So when you're talking through, you know, kicking off a project, the first time they're hearing about the customer's pain is not in a slide deck. It's from, you know, an actual customer. And I think through that, you're giving the team the information and the tools that they need so that they don't always need to rely on you. Like, I feel like I've done a good job when the team has enough information to answer questions without me, or like just maybe not need to even include me in a meeting because they're just like caught up, they get it, they can move forward. And then I think, since we're talking about the overlap between product and design as well, the sort of clearly defined roles, trying to clearly define roles and responsibilities, even if it's just on that project or whatever it is. I think something that I've personally found challenging is sort of moving from design to product, and ensuring that, you know, the designer and designers on my team feel empowered to do their job, and not like I'm sort of still like encroaching on little bits of design along the way. So I think that's at least something that I'm working on.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Hilary. I want to circle back to something that Maya mentioned. You mentioned that you worked with some of the team was remote, and you worked with some international colleagues, and this is something that is currently a big thing for a lot of us. We're facing remote work every day. In the past, like 8 months, 6 months, I don't even know how long it's been maybe like 25 years. Unfortunately, our current situation forced us into working fully remote, and I just wanted to ask the next question about remote collaboration, and what have you found especially effective working for you and your product team? And this question goes to Tyler.
Yeah, so something that's been effective for us is just trying to replicate what I call the walk up to my desk and ask me a question environment that we used to have pre-COVID. So the way that we've done this is we've done a midweek check-in. So, you know, the way we work at Klaviyo, we kind of define our sprint at the end of the week. And pre-COVID, if my engineers had any questions, they would just walk up to me and ask them in real time. That's obviously not something that we can do anymore. So the midweek check-in has been a great way to just replicate that environment and give us a space and time to check in that's kind of outside of our normal meeting schedule. So we can bring up, you know, issues that we're seeing, concerns that we have, ambiguity that needs to be burned down. And I found that it's actually made the team more effective in a way, because it lowers the cost of constantly context switching between what I'm doing and what my engineers need or my designers need. Everyone kind of reserves their questions, you know, for our midweek check-in, and we really have a deep discussion around that, and it's been really fruitful so far. So that's one way that we've managed to maintain that environment in my job.
Thanks for sharing, Tyler. Kira, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've really started doing more regularly is borrowed from my colleague Adam, who I believe is on this call. Hi, Adam. Adam's been a remote employee for his past few jobs, so he's kind of mastered this already. But I think that sharing your work as a designer can be difficult without getting folks in a room. You know, like, you really want to explain your problem solving and how you're thinking about things. And a great way that Adam has done it for a while is just kind of recording a quick video, like a screen grab and a voiceover, either to get design feedback or to kind of pitch like a final solution. And I've started doing that, and it's been really successful. I think one thing that has been fatiguing about working remotely is, you know, being on Zoom calls all day. So to present your work over and over again to like a different group of 1 or 2 can get pretty tiring. So if you instead record a 5-minute video, you could just send that file over and over again, which is pretty nice. And it's a great artifact. So thank you, Adam, for the tip.
That's a great tip. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you, Adam, for teaching us all your secret sauce. Sounds like we've covered most of the questions, and it brings me to my last question before we go to Q&A. And that is, when it comes to being a strong product leader, are there any resources or recommendations that you have and believe that every person in the audience should check out and learn? Hilary, would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, I just had some thoughts for, you know, any of the designers out there who might be thinking about product management and trying to make that switch. I found personally that there was a ton that you could learn online as you were like, you know, still cruising away at being a designer. I took an online course through BU and edX that was super helpful. And I think it allowed me to sort of like advocate to take on some small projects first and see if I liked it first of all, and if, you know, it was something that I might want to do. So I think, you know, there are some great resources out there like that. And then also one book that, you know, we've passed around a lot at Notarize has been Cracking the PM Interview. I think it's just a really helpful like way to get some insight into how, you know, how you think from the perspective of a product manager, and it was super helpful to me.
Actually, adding on to that a bit, one resource that's been amazing for me is just like a couple of like really high quality books. The Art of Thinking Clearly is an awesome one. It goes through like different logical fallacies that people trip up on all the time. I would strongly recommend that. And then something that Maya mentioned around like proper timing. I think Maya and also Cara mentioned it around proper timing. There's a book called When, like the art of like when to introduce something. And I remember it gave me this like amazing insight about, you know, doing things early in the morning, never leave a strategic decision till like 3, 4, or 5 o'clock when people are kind of want to go home and are burning down for the day. Just like little things that I never thought about. So those 2 books are ones that I would absolutely recommend to anyone.
Those are wonderful suggestions. Anybody else? Oh.
Yeah, I would just say my kind of go-to is Envision's content. I think Envision is a really great thought leader in the design and product community. And I really like their, you know, as a lightweight way to take in information, they have a podcast series called Design Better, I believe. So yeah, if you're just looking for kind of easy ways to read quick articles or, you know, subscribe to something that's going to give you constant high quality content, I would recommend Envision.
Thank you so much, Cara. All right. Well, thank you, ladies. And so now the time has come for the questions from the audience. Everyone, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we will try to answer them one at a time. All right. I'm trying to see first question started. All right, the first question is from Paulina. Ladies, can you think of when trying for a product to stay user-focused, you were facing a challenge of convincing stakeholders when user needs were somehow in conflict with business needs?
I can take this one. Yes, so I want to say that this is definitely, it was just like my everyday in consulting, and I think one of my former coworkers are on the call, so they know this to be true. So I'm trying to frame my answer in a way that makes sense. So basically, to set up the scenario, I was working on this big project with a power plant conglomerate out in Texas. One of our stakeholders was, of course, the client, which was like the IT department. And then our actual users, like the IT department were a super user, but our actual users were other folks that worked like for the power plant company. And so the stakeholder in general just had a lot of opinions. They'd been working at the company for a very long time. This was like their baby. They had pushed for this project to even happen. And they're also our main point of contact. So anytime that they were in a room with the other users, also it was out in Texas and we were in Boston. So a lot of the conversations were remote. So anytime that they were like in the room with the other users, when we were trying to like go over some designs or something like that, they would overpower and the users wouldn't really say anything at all. They're very apathetic because they felt like it doesn't matter. The bigger company is going to do whatever they want to do. We don't have a say. So what we did was looked for the little wins. So it's a tricky balance, of course, consulting, because the client can say, I want it this way because I'm the client and I'm paying for it. And so what I mean by little wins are, for example, we were listening this one day and somebody a user offhandedly mentioned, hey, I work the third shift. It hurts my eyes. My phone now does dark mode. Is this something like, could that be something we do? And we were like, yes. And we latched onto that because it was something we could incorporate into the designs where we were. It wasn't going to be too painful. We all aligned internally. We were like, yes, we can do this little thing. One part, we did it pretty early on, part to earn trust with users to be like, hey, we're listening to you, even if you think like your boss is kind of overpowering. And so that was one way. I'm not saying to be sneaky, but we were being a little sneaky. To Cara's point, I thought she brought up a great thing about putting things into the backlog to put in to, have them come up later. That was like, I was like, genius, sneaky, I love it. And so the other frame of reference I'll say is, the other thing that worked was, we did this in two parts where we would work with the users by themselves to like dig out some stuff that wasn't coming up during our other reviews with the client there, or with the stakeholder, key stakeholders that I mentioned there, and then brought those things up in the meeting with the key stakeholder and talked about them as like what I was mentioning earlier about bringing people in early on so they can see the pain for themselves. This worked pretty well. I'm telling you, this stakeholder was very stuck in the mud, and some things we lost and some things we won. But I would say that was how we handled it, was we just really tried to listen to the users when we could, and pushed whatever we could through it that made sense, like dark mode, as well as if it was a bigger issue that we really thought was super important, imperative to do, we took that time to make sure we talked with users, understood it, brought them in for some of those sessions so they could understand those pain points. And then sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So it's a trade-off, and that experience has really made me not appreciative, but like when I see bad UX, I'm like, there was more at play here. Like, I'm sure this wasn't what the designer intended, right? There's so many things at play that those would be my two little pieces, as well as just like, sometimes it doesn't work. I don't know if that's good advice, but.
I think too, anything that you can do to kind of pull data that you have into it. Like, I think sometimes it's hard for those stakeholders to like anecdotally hear about things, and if they can, you know, see some numbers around it and what the business impact of making these changes is going to be, it can be helpful. I think, you know, we've done things like, you know, trying to look at how much money we're losing when people make this simple mistake. Or I had a colleague once sort of we were looking at implementing a design system, and it feels like a lot of design overhead, and what value is this really bringing? And then you start to look at like, what's the engineering time? Like, how much money are you spending on having the engineer rebuild this thing every single time? And you start to add up that time and cost, and all of a sudden the design overhead doesn't look so big.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to move on to the next question. The next question is from initials FA. Tyler, can you repeat the name of the second book?
Yeah, I posted it in the chat too, but it's called When, The Scientific Secrets of Perfect Timing.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you. So the next question is from Jillian. What metrics do you think are the most important to track when trying to prevent churn?
I have a perspective on this I can share. So when I think about churn, I actually categorize it into two different buckets. So when you think about a retention curve for your users, you have users that never really saw the value of it and then turned out. And you have users that retained and kept it, and so they're your users that you like. And then you have users that retained and kept it but then turned out. So when I'm thinking of churn, I really think of it in those two buckets and figuring out how many users did basically, you know, did I fail to convert and capture into adopting the feature as a habit and getting information around that. And then how many users were retained but eventually churned out and dropped the feature and getting information around that. And I think splitting it up into those buckets will give you a richer understanding of churn, because you want to understand why your existing users who have adopted it are no longer using the feature, whether that they found a solution that was better, if they're only using your feature because it's the only option available and not because they actually like your feature. And you also want to figure out why people aren't getting activated in the first place. Is it because they failed to see the value? Is it because you're not meeting market parity, things like that. So I like to separate those into two discrete buckets.
Thank you, Tyler. The next question is from Kim. For the question regarding how to prioritize what to build and what features, what methods or tools do you use for getting product and engineering to articulate that? What criteria do you use to measure the impact of the feature, either to do or not to do?
I think we recently sort of implemented a new process for this at Notarize, which I can take zero credit for, but I'll tell you about it. And I think it's been really interesting to see. So we basically, well, for a while we had been using ICE methodology, so the impact, confidence, and effort, and you give those a 1 through 10 score. Effort is usually in engineering weeks. And so we started to sort of pull stakeholders. We basically pulled stakeholders into initial conversations and had a list of projects to prioritize sort of longer term for our roadmap, they helped us come up with the business impact score. And we kind of ranked it loosely on like a 1, 5, and a 10, 10 being the sort of most impactful. And then took a look at engineering weeks and then also design weeks and sort of looked at those across, basically applied all of those to like true time. So you could say like, oh, you know, this project, we basically like took the business, sorry, I'm not describing this well, took the business goals, what percentage, and thought about like what percentage sort of each goal was going to get, and then sort of took it out and said like, essentially you've got, you know, 20 engineering points for this business goal, and sort of blocked it out that way in terms of what we had the capacity to actually do. And those were based on sort of the effort, so the engineering weeks. And then we went back to stakeholders and kind of said, hey, this bucket has, you know, 30 or so points in it. You're allocated 20. Like, how would you prioritize these things? Would you still do all of them? If you could only do 3, which 3 would they be? And really like kind of used that point system to sort of force some of those hard trade-offs, even though they were sort of, you know, we weren't actively working on them yet. They were sort of false trade-offs at this point, but I think it helped, you know, force that conversation and at least give us a rough prioritization that then as new things, you know, new ideas come up, new projects come up, we can sort of trade off as we go. Sorry, that's sort of a rambling answer and probably hard to follow, but hopefully helpful.
No, definitely. This is great. Thank you so much, Hilary. This is a great answer. The next question is from Emily. Tyler, you mentioned gathering user feedback from customer-facing teams and people to help you understand the users and what's important to them. And a challenge that I've run into when doing that is that removing bias from the feedback. Each team has different goals and perspectives. How do you get to the truth from that feedback?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One thing I want to preface my answer with is that bias is not necessarily a bad thing when you're getting feedback from customer-facing teams. I think a big part of our role as product managers, as product designers, is empathy, not just for our users, but also for our coworkers. So to give you an example of that, I had a customer success manager who was talking to me about a problem. They mentioned, you know, I spend a lot of time with customers just trying to untangle this problem. And because of that, I can't spend my time having the most impact possible, which is helping them think through strategy. I didn't even realize that my product had those kinds of implications on them. So sometimes you're not even really trying to get the customer feedback. You're trying to understand how your product impacts, enables, or essentially disables your coworkers around you. So keep that sort of underlying motive in mind. But for getting at the core why, a lot of it's just in how you frame your questions. So I really try to make sure I'm not asking like, you know, what's your solution for this? Or like, what do you think customers want to do? But rather, what problems are customers bringing to you? What issues are they commonly talking to you about? What do you find that you spend a lot of time on? And when they start proposing solutions, I'll start going into not necessarily asking why, because people don't respond well to why. It kind of feels like you're like assaulting someone, like it's very confrontational. Instead, I ask, you know, how do you think that solution will enable you? How's it going to enable your customer? What is that going to allow you to do that you couldn't do before, allow them to do that you couldn't do before? So finding ways to reword those why questions is really helpful. There's actually, if you have masterclass, there's this guy who does a class on negotiation techniques. He's a hostage negotiator. And they're actually amazing user interview techniques for literally any context. It's the weirdest thing. But I would definitely recommend looking at that. He has so many great ways for like getting at the true crux of someone's needs.
I think too, oh sorry, you can contrast it with any data that you have. Like we recently, you know, we're sort of running into a situation where we were getting like very urgent feedback from our customer success team because, you know, we were it was an example where transactions were failing and they were getting, you know, they were getting an earful from the customer. And so for them, like that is like, that's going to bubble up to the top of the list every time. Like they're feeling that very acutely. They're on the phone with the customer. It feels bad. but just making sure that we're going back and looking at like, okay, but what, you know, what's the actual percentage of transactions that are running into these issues? Is it a large number, or is it relatively small that can be, you know, supported, maybe not through the product? Maybe it isn't a case of like rethinking this whole experience. It's, you know, how can we help these 3 or 4, you know, customer interactions that they're having that are very impactful for the customer success manager, but maybe don't tell the real story about the product and what's happening for most of the users.
Yeah, I would love to jump on and echo this too. I think not only kind of pointing towards data of how frequently things are happening, but also again pointing back to I apologize, I don't remember who said this before. I think it was Tyler, but kind of having like a vision to point towards. And, you know, like sometimes it's hard to decipher, you know, some people's voices are louder than others when they kind of communicate like, oh, this is a really big problem for my team. But again, like, yeah, cross-referencing it with how frequently it's happening, and maybe cross-referencing it with, is this in line with what we want to do, can really kind of help, I guess, kind of clear up what you should do.
Thank you so much for answering that question. The next question we have, and I'm also watching the time. I know we only have 3 minutes left, so we're going to take this question from Miwako. Hilary, this question is for Hilary and other speakers, but Hilary, you mentioned there's a sales element to product management to get all stakeholders on board with your design or project pitch. How do you hone the skill, or is it something that is shaped over time with experience?
Yeah, I think it's something that you practice and you sort of figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I think like going, you know, back to the idea of sort of really getting to know all of the stakeholders and your team and understanding what makes them tick, kind of figuring out what's going to tell the most compelling story to different people. Some people love numbers, some people love, you know, hearing from the customer directly. And I think, I forget who mentioned it too, but kind of like being visible and showing, you know, showing your work often, bringing people along for the whole ride. I think like, even if it's a half-baked idea, but you're super excited about it, like I think that comes out when you're talking to people, and you start to get their ideas and can incorporate it, and you know, all of a sudden it feels like their pet project too, or whatever it is. And so I think as much as you can, just always keep that in the back of your mind. Like you're basically always selling it, because there's going to be something else, some other project that all of a sudden feels like a more urgent priority, and you kind of always want to keep, you know, focused on the, you know, the project at hand.
Great. Thank you so much, Hilary. All right, so we are 1 minute away till the end of the event. I'm going to share the poll results right now. And so as you can see, this event was mostly attended by designers, but then we had a great variety of other disciplines. I would like to make sure that I give huge thanks to Maya, Cara, Tyler, and Hilary for sharing your wisdom with us. I surely learned a lot tonight, and I hope that each one of you in the audience got some actionable takeaways from tonight's discussion that you can go and apply tomorrow at your job. Thank you again to our sponsors sponsor, BotKeeper, for generous sponsorship of our event. And thank you to our amazing audience, to our community, to everybody who attended and who's continuously supporting us. Thank you all for the great questions tonight and for being just an amazing audience. Have a good evening, everyone. And until next time.
Thank you,
Thank
Olga.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. It's fun.
Thank you all.